since 2008, actually we've seen the coming alive of the banking battlefield like never before. It used to be that big banks were just competing with smaller banks, but fundamentally now we're seeing big startups being able to come into the market as tiny little things with an amazing beachhead, but be in a situation where they're scaling faster than ever before. Now, the ripple that's had globally is amazing as well. We're seeing Nubank acquire over 25 million customers. These organizations are getting to the scale of some of the very biggest financial services organizations on the planet. And that's before we even get into the looming threats of big technology companies or even the non-banks that are really straying into this territory.
Today, the banking battlefield has been blown wide open. Banks find themselves in an increasingly competitive market. This is a position they've never been in before, and the game has completely changed.
I think we're in a really interesting place when it comes to the current banking landscape. I think there's a number of competing forces. I think there's a lot of change happening, but I think we're almost at a tipping point.
We're in this weird period right now where there's a lot of big legacy banks that we sort of refer to as dinosaurs, and there's a bunch of small mammal-like startups or neobanks or challenger banks that are sort of like creeping up from behind.
It used to be Barclays Bank or whoever on the high street. Actually, financial services is popping up in every different slice of life.
And once people have got accustomed to using the mobile app and what can be done without attending branch, I, for one, am pretty convinced that people aren't going to revert to some of those prior habits.
We are in the middle of ecosystem disruption. Almost any company now can offer the things that once were only offered by chartered, licensed entities. And so this is a brand new game.
All of this leads to when people really have to compete for customers' attention, fundamentally the products, the services, and everything that happens in the market keep getting better.
To better understand the banking battlefield and the challenges posed to the traditional banks, you have to understand banking itself and what a bank actually is to appreciate how the biggest banks got to where they are today.
So in order to understand banking, you really need to understand money, because ultimately, banking is about three things, right? It's about storing money, lending money, and moving money. And in order to understand that, you need to understand how things have progressed historically. Now, if you think about it in caveman times, if you had an asset, spears, fish, and you wanted to trade it for something else, you really had to hope that other person had what you wanted. It was a direct one-to-one barter trade. It was very difficult if that other person didn't have the stuff you wanted to get a trade. Your fish would rot. Your mammoth meat would no longer be usable.
Over time, the same type of asset would get traded within communities. For example, fish in a fishing village. But fish are perishable and don't last for very long. So you needed an asset that could be traded in the future. And importantly, one that didn't rot, such as a metal. And in particular, metals that did not react with other elements, which is why silver and gold became so popular in the creation of money.
Now, money really has three core capabilities. What you really want from money is you want it to be able to act as a store of value. So you want to have piles of these assets sitting around and you can spend it in the future. You want to have an asset that actually other people want to be able to use, i.e. you need to use it as a medium of exchange. And you really want to be able to work out how much other things cost in terms of that asset. So it needs to be a unit of account, effectively a price.
Well, the origins of banking go back 10,000 years when we invented money. It became more and more mature during the Roman civilization 2,000 years ago, which within the Bible many will quote, Jesus throwing out the bankers from the temple who were doing loans on the tables. And in fact, banco is a bench. And so, bankrupt was when you broke the bench in the temple to get rid of the guys bartering and trading over the table with money and loans.
Over time, trading expanded beyond a barter system to a monetary and lending system, where they used precious metals and coins in lieu of physical goods. And these coins began to pile up.
The problem with these small, non-perishable assets is that whilst they're great for trade, they're also easily stealable. And what you wanted to be able to do was store them in some place that was safe and secure. In most villages, the safest and securest place was the goldsmiths. This was somebody who by nature was making a lot of jewellery, and so they had the biggest and strongest places in the village. What happened over time was that people would turn up to the goldsmith and say, "Hey, Mr. Goldsmith, do you mind looking after some of my gold for me?" And you'd say, "That's fine. And he'd give you a receipt for that piece of gold in some way, shape or form. And there you would have his gold sitting there. Now, what happened if you want to do a trade? Well, you'd have to take your receipt back to the goldsmith. You'd say, hey, Mr. Goldsmith, can I have my gold? He would give you the gold. You would go and give that to the person who you want to do the trade with, and you would take their good. They would probably then take that gold and put it back into the goldsmith's place and get a new receipt. And that was fine. You were getting movement of funds in and out of the gold by physical transfer. Over time, people realised, hold on, we've all got the same kind of receipts from the same goldsmith. Maybe we can just, if we all trust the goldsmith and we trust his receipt, actually I can take this as a proxy for the gold that's in the goldsmith's, therefore I'm actually happy to take the paper receipt. So rather than transferring the money physically between pile 1 and pile 2, actually you just transfer the receipt between people.
The setup of goldsmiths storing money and issuing receipts enabled the first iterations of what we now call a bank.
But the real modern-day banking, I guess, came out of Italy again. But during the Renaissance with the Medicis, the oldest bank in the world is Banca Monte dei Paschi di Siena, which was formed in 1472 and still survives today, although it's just being acquired by UniCredit. And when you say banks are going back to the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, you start to realise there's a reason why they're that old, and the reason they're that old is that they are the core of what holds together the economy and the government and society. You take that away, you have anarchy.
The role of a bank in an economy is, I would almost say, is like the oil in a machine, right? It's fundamentally the thing which helps all the other sort of cogs turn. So much of sort of just being able to transact is based on money, and fundamentally banks have been evolved over thousands of years to effectively get to a position where they are the entity which helps actually provide that oil to an economy.
Banks are always going to exist. Whatever the new technology is, at the end of the day, even with crypto, if you want to use money, it's got to go into a bank account.
There's a number of ways you can define the primary role of a bank, but traditionally, it's about receiving deposits. It's about then acting as a multiplier, a creator of private money within the wider economy. But fundamentally, there is that promissory relationship between them and a client, either to safeguard a deposit or to be a source of lending. And at its core, most banking activity still boils down to that today.
Banks play a pivotal role in society and the economy, and their success is hard-earned over the centuries.
So a bank is a really privileged position in society, which is probably why it's so hard to get a banking license. Like, there wasn't a banking license for 135 years, and the old banks were all formed in like the 16 and 1700s.
If you're a bank, you typically have 5 times more regulation than a technology company, because it's not a problem if you lose a Facebook photo. It's a problem if you lose 100,000 euros in a transaction. And in fact, that full banking license deposit-taking ability is one of the biggest barriers for new companies to enter, because you need to have millions of capital before you get the license. And that's why most big tech companies and most fintech companies don't become fully deposit license holding banks, because that's a big challenge.
Many fintechs find success in different parts of the banking system without becoming a fully licensed deposit-holding bank.
The fintechs that have been most successful so far are those that actually take what banks do badly on the network and fix it, like the Stripes and the Klarnas, who have invented new products in several instances. Companies that are trying to attack banks face-to-face, head-to-head, are, to be honest, struggling, because banks are quite good at keeping their turf.
If I look at challenges over the last 10 years, some have landed, some have done quite well. If you look at the overall market share they have versus the big 5, probably hasn't changed that much.
But I don't think they've had a really material impact on the big banks. And interesting, if you look at them, NatWest, for example, has shut their digital bank down. So I don't think they've been impacted to the way that potentially they could have been.
New players, beware. This isn't an easy game. Traditional banks are still trusted providers. With millions of customers around the world, it's not going to be easy to topple them. However, the banks can't ignore the challenges. Customers are interacting with finance in a whole new way. and the role of banking itself is changing.
The points that we were making on the banking battlefield, why has that change actually happened? It's because we've seen those, new pups coming into the industry and showing the old players that actually the level of service that was being provided and fundamentally the business models of banking really needed to evolve.
But if you go back 10 to 20 years, you were going to do your banking with a local financial institution, typically the one that your parents did their banking with, and everything was very cut and dried. And that single relationship was providing you everything you materially needed in the way of financial services. We are no longer in that context. You have average consumers with 4 to 7 different financial service provider relationships. That fragmentation is new. So I see the role as the bank now as helping simplify the complexity that surrounds the customer and helps them make a path through that to reduce the barriers to financial health.
I mean, the challenge really is when you start seeing what could a bank be. Banks could be so much more than that. Actually, if your health provider just pointed out why you were unhealthy, rather than actually trying to help you be healthy or helped you make better decisions to improve your overall health, this is really where I think financial services can get to.
The opportunities for what financial services could be, beyond the primary role it's held since its inception, are huge. But there is no blueprint for how to get there. The winners could be anyone, and everyone is trying to figure this out at the same time.
Ever since the first digital banks arrived, the question became, will the big banks get smart first or the smart banks get big?
We've got a lot of financial institutions, and for that matter, fintech players, that are a bit lost in exactly what to do with all of the opportunity, but we need a new framework, a new ecosystem strategy framework for where we are.
To better understand where the ecosystem is going, we have to understand how it got to this point. The game has changed on the banking battlefield, bringing opportunities for all players, but also challenges especially for the traditional banks. Join us as we break down the banking ecosystem across this series to better explore how each of the component parts came to be and how the traditional banks can chart their course across the evolving battlefield.